it's so dark. I forgot to turn on the light. There we go. That's much better. Oh, and you can see all my fabulous clothes that I never have time to wear. Oh, how unfortuitous. You can tell I didn't do background today. What a mess. Oh, phone. Ugh. Definitely shut that off. We don't need any more interruptions than I've already made by not being completely and totally prepared for the news hour. But welcome, everyone. Let me shut this off so that... There we go. All right, now we're ready. Only a little bit behind. Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal News Hour. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. It is... It's been a busy news week in despite of the holiday. I hope everyone had a Thanksgiving. I made lasagna and rolls. We had wonderful pies. And it was excellent, and I had a nice weekend of rest. I took off. I did end up doing some writing and some organizing and all this type of thing, but I really took some time off, which was great because, as everyone knows, I don't just do the news hour. I also produce the podcast and write at the Cameron Journal, and I work at my book publisher, Something Other Publishing, and so basically I work several jobs, and so it was really nice to have Thursday, Friday, and the weekend to just kind of rest and recharge and all this type of thing. But the world was very busy. I could have made TikToks. I didn't, but I thought about it because the world has been absolutely busy and crazy. Obviously, with some leading stories like the Hunter Biden pardon and Trump's conversation on tariffs and Justin Trudeau going to Mar-a-Lago to visit Trump because of his proposed tariffs and all this sort of thing. And so it's been a lot, is my point. It's been a lot, and I sincerely hope that that all of this stuff gets figured out. But I'm gonna break it all down. And we're going to get into it. So, before we talk about tariffs and everything, I want really to, well, let's start with the easy stuff first. So, Blue Sky versus Twitter versus Threads. So, as you know, after the election, there's been a bit of a liberal exodus from Twitter to a new app called Blue Sky. And Blue Sky's kind of been in the news because a lot of celebrities and other stars have been moving over to Blue Sky, and they now have more users than Threads. And their growth just in the last month has been explosive. And that has been really has been, just a tremendous journey, and people are really enjoying it and all this type of thing. But it it kind of looks like Elon and some others are not thrilled with the growth of Blue Sky, mostly because, I mean, let's face it, the whole point of Elon buying Twitter was to control the world's town square. He talks a lot about free speech and everything, but I would argue that some of the speech that he allows is not great for society or people or this type of thing, and that's a whole other conversation. But he bought Twitter to have control over that space. And as I've always said, Twitter has always been a middling social media platform. The only reason Twitter had potency is because it was where celebrities and politicians, people who have reach, hang out. And corporations and companies, all this sort of thing. And so, because Twitter never had a lot of users, relative to its competitors, always struggled to make money relative to competitors, all this type of thing. Um, the its user base was what its true power. Blue Sky is starting to supplant the thing that makes Twitter special. And so now there's been this conversation over, is Blue Sky coming to eat Elon's lunch? And is Twitter going to become the new Truth Social? I don't necessarily think that that's going to happen. Blue Sky doesn't have some certain features yet and all this type of thing. I wouldn't be surprised if, Truth Social and Twitter merge maybe or something like that. Where which could be a huge cash out for Trump. Which is why it might happen, and all this sort of thing. But I mean, Elon has overseen such a destruction of value at Twitter because they don't moderate content the way they used to. All the racism and misogyny and terrible stuff is back, which means brands don't want to advertise. And so now, if you look at the ads on Twitter, it's supplement bills and all this type of thing. It's a completely other world in place, and so people are decamping to Blue Sky. In pretty significant numbers. I'm sure Zuck wishes that Threads had more of a sticky point. Threads kind of struggles along with its 200 million users, and it's also highly attached to Instagram. You can't have a Threads account without Instagram, whereas on Blue Sky you can just sign up. All this type of thing. So it's a very different situation. I will let you know that I am now on Blue Sky under @CameronJournal. It's cameronjournal.bsky.social. And so you can look me up on Blue Sky if that's your preferred social media platform. I just set up the stuff to start having Cameron Journal stuff post into Blue Sky and everything. And I'm getting more active there, kind of responding to stuff and having conversations and all this type of thing. And I do find myself kind of using Twitter a little bit less and whatnot. So, and my Twitter account's very old. My Twitter account dates back from 2008. So, when you're starting to lose OG people like me, it's not a good thing. Wait. There we go. So, that's has kind of been a thing over the last little while that I thought was rather interesting to talk about and get into. The other, let's see. Do we want to talk about Pod Save America and the Harris situation, or do we want to talk about Canada, Mexico, and tariffs? Let's do Canada, Mexico, and tariffs before we get into election stuff. So, in case you didn't know, I think we talked about this last week. Trump announced that if Mexico and Canada did not go along with his new border plans and his new border policies, that he would be enacting 25% tariffs on anything coming into the country from Mexico and Canada. Now, the response from Mexico and Canada has been, well, Trudeau went to Trump to try to explain, look, this is going to cost you a lot of money and be very bad for our economy, and Canada's economy is not that great anyway, so, that's kind of a huge problem for them. And so Trudeau's trying to reason with the man. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has threatened to expel American citizens who live in Mexico. She's threatened to put tariffs on American imports. Mexico is the United States' biggest trading partner. So the point of this is that we do a lot of trade with Canada and Mexico. That's a lot of trade, and then China's, kind of an also-ran. Especially post-pandemic when so much stuff has left China. And the reality, and people forget this, is that tariffs are paid by the company and the consumers obviously importing, not by the country exporting. People forget that sort of thing, but it's true. And so you have this terrible situation where the only people that benefit from this new tariff regime is basically nobody. That's kind of one of the sad things about a trade war, is that everyone sort of loses. But in this case, it's an extra loss because we import a great deal of oil from Canada, especially in the Midwest. The auto industry is completely dependent on Canada and Mexico for auto parts, engines in Mexico, all this type of thing. We don't really make engines in America anymore. And in this whole discussion, which has been ongoing for several days, I saw this TikTok of this guy who said, no, the point of the tariffs is to get people to buy and make things in America. And no one ever seems to understand that's probably not going to be the result. Will some stuff come back? Yeah, probably. I even said post-pandemic, it's not necessarily practical and resilient to have a 3,000-mile long supply chain. You need to make it closer. May I suggest Mexico, Central America, South America? May I suggest Canada? All this type of thing. That trend's already been in place for 3 years. Here's the problem why you cannot necessarily make everything in America or encourage everything to be made here. And the reason's very simple. The cost of labor in the United States is too high. American labor is the most expensive in the world. Now, it is incredibly high quality, but you pay for it. And so, for a lot of things, especially high input, low margin things, it's very hard to make money on stuff and make it in America at a price that's reasonable. And here's the other half, is even if we did do that, let's say we really do bring manufacturing back, you then have, and you can deal with the cost of labor, you then have 2 other problems. One, consumers are going to be pissed off because everything gets dramatically more expensive. We go back to the days when people didn't buy clothes all the time. People didn't buy new cars all the time. People didn't buy household appliances all the time. You bought and hung on to that stuff because it was expensive. You didn't just go out. The throwaway stuff that we have and all this type of thing, that will be non-existent. Fast fashion will not be a thing. That's your first problem, is consumers will be pissed because it's going to require a huge change in lifestyle. Then, the other problem you have with that, with trying to make everything in America, is labor. Where's the labor going to come from? Who's going to do this? Especially given the mass deportations that Trump wants to do, which is a lot of the labor that would be working in these factories and all this type of thing. Then all of a sudden you have a situation where, who's going to work in the new factories? We will say, well, those are creating good American jobs. Okay, fair, but let's also consider we have the lowest labor force participation rate in American history right now. We have a significant portion of the population that's in retirement and aging out and dying. We have the millennials, which are in their 30s and 40s, very large generation. The generations coming after them are not nearly as large. So you might get away with this for 10 years, 20 years, maybe. And that's a nice run, for sure. It would get a lot of people to retirement, maybe. But it's not necessarily sustainable without an influx of workers. You're also presuming that the Americans that you can hire have the skills to work in this stuff. I have a dear friend of mine who's a seamstress, and she does bridal alterations and custom bridal work and all this type of thing. And not only were we talking about how unaffordable bridal dresses would get if the fabric is tariffed and the dress itself in its finished form is tariffed, because none of that's made in America. All that's made in Asia. A lot of Vietnam, a lot of Laos, a lot of Thailand, a lot of China. But then also all the inputs, every button, every clasp, the thread, all this sort of thing. That all's tariff too. Okay, who's going to make that in this country? And then, even if you want to start making clothes in this country, you have to set up an entire supply chain for all the notions, all the fabric, the synthetic fibers, the natural fibers you'll need because most things are blended. And then you also need the people who can actually sew, which is basically a dying art. Good luck finding 1,000 people, women usually, who can sew. Now, if you leave the immigrants alone, you might find those 1,000 women and you might actually start getting some textile manufacturing going. But if you deport all of those women who might actually know how to sew, and then you also want to open textiles, that's not going to work. Repeat for automotive. Repeat for all this stuff. It's not practical. We have been in a globalized economy for far too long. We don't have the people, we don't have the skills, and even if we did, it's too expensive. So this whole tariff idea, I mean, it wasn't great when Trump did it the first time with China, and he cost a lot of soybean farmers a lot of money and all this type of thing. But the reality is, the strength of America economically is that we trade with nearly everyone. Now, I understand the point of this is to bring down the trade deficit, to kind of even things out, because we have been importing more than we have been exporting. However, we also don't fall into the trap, as Japan did in the 90s, as China is now, of trying to switch from an export led economy to domestic consumption. The United States already did that. We have a deep enough domestic consumption that we can support our own business and not be export led. In fact, we import more than we export. And I get wanting to even that out, sort of thing. But the reality is, between the cost of labor, the lack of skills, you end up with the situation where it's really not practical in business terms to do this. But I think it's going to end up being a lot of posturing, because they already kind of resolved stuff with Mexico, because Mexico agreed to do some stuff it was already doing, and then Trump congratulated Mexico on wanting to, wanting to do this. I did see someone mention the fact that, Trump doesn't officially take office until January, but world leaders are already, like, coming to kiss the ring. It's almost like people have kind of forgotten that Joe Biden is still president for another, like, month and 7 weeks or so. Um, Although they were reminded last night, because Joe Biden pardoned his son Hunter of all federal crimes over the last 10 years, between 2014 and 2024. Um, yeah, that has it set social media afire last night. And it further set social media afire today. Obviously, Republicans are not, are mad because they've been all about that Hunter Biden laptop story for a long time. Um, but Democrats it's destroying his legacy and all norms and values of democracy and everything he stood for, and it isn't playing well. I think he knew that. Um, I maybe would have waited, a little closer to January 20th, to do it. But I guess, a nice Christmas present to him. If anything, it gives Hunter more time to deal with the stripper he knocked up in Arkansas and his new child that she is raising. Maybe cruise on down there, see how they're doing. So no, I'm not a Hunter Biden apologist. The dude's crazy. Okay, he smoked crack. I've seen more of Hunter Biden than I ever wanted to know or see. There's not a part of that man that the general public has not seen, because we all watch those videos, of him sitting in bathtubs with guns, smoking crack, all this type of thing. We have seen every part of this man we wanted to see. And I'm not an apologist. I mean, sort of thing. And, someone brought up the fact, Democrats want, more gun control, but now they're pardoning gun control criminals. And it's quite insane. It's quite, it's politically very difficult. It was always going to be politically difficult. But I think at this point, Biden doesn't care. He did what he, as I said, he did what he could. I was meant to comment on something on Twitter this weekend where I said he did what he could. He tried. He was a great champion. This was never meant to be some great, huge, sweeping, victory sort of thing. Yeah, it's this is how it was. This is how it always was going to be. And I think it's quite telling how many Democrats, rather than understanding all of this and sort of, maybe not being supportive but not complaining about it, are just complaining that it's unfair and terrible and all this type of thing. Meanwhile, Trump has just appointed Jared Kushner's father to be ambassador to France, because that's the country we live in now, where we do personal favors in public office for family, friends, fellow in-laws, all this sort of thing. that's the America that we live in. Before I get into some of the other stories, we have a lot of banking stuff this week. I did want to mention that I had been sent some material from a listener and reader, um, about a sort of interesting phenomena. It doesn't seem like it's that widespread, but they did send in some videos about people being assaulted for being Trump supporters, and it is a quite it is quite harrowing, I will say. Um, to There's a one video is a story from Boulder, Colorado, um, where this woman assaulted a younger man. One was a 12-year-old boy in Texas who's gotten assaulted for his Trump sign and all this sort of thing. And that obviously is a terrible thing, and we don't condone that sort of violence. There's no reason to hurt anyone physically over the election. As people know, the election affected me in a very deep way. If you've watched the show for the last month, you'll know I've had to come to a lot of new realities and a lot of new understandings of the election. That does not excuse violence in any form. And I think it is, but I think here's the problem, and this, those kind of sort of the point of this person, is that every time that stuff happens, it just fuels the right wing rage machine. And I think there's, unfortunately, a lot of people on the left who do stuff that it's like, well, you might as well just call the everyone in right-wing media and just let them know what you're doing, because the right-wing media will take all these stories together, they'll make it a trend, it'll become a thing, and then the narrative, not the reality, the narrative then becomes that Trump supporters are an oppressed minority getting attacked by angry leftists who lost an election. Now, no one ever wants to talk about the fact that the last time the Trump folks lost, they tried to burn down the Capitol and killed somebody, and and invaded spaces where they did not belong, and had, members of Congress running for the exits and all this sort of thing. Whoever wants to talk about that, but it's and that, but that then it then becomes a right wing talking point. There goes the, as Janine Pirro would say, the loony left, or Laura Ingraham, the liberal elites, are at it again, because because they don't. And I think this is the fundamental difference between Trump supporters and Democrats. Trump supporters don't take this stuff nearly as seriously. I have gotten and had so many conversations in the last month since the election, and one person who I talked to was kind of like, oh my god, I didn't realize this was going to affect you so much. I'm really sorry that's affecting you. And I'm kind of like, I mean, I get that you're side one, but how's it not affecting you? And I realize they don't really take this stuff that seriously. It's kind of a game, It's just sort of it's the next season of the reality show. It's the next part of what's going on. And I think a lot of Democrats don't necessarily understand that the other side doesn't take it that seriously, and they don't take themselves that seriously. And I think a lot of the liberal posturing and all this type of thing leads to a situation where, how do I say this? It leads to a situation where people don't, they just kind of don't care. And so for them, this is all so extreme. It's like, well, why would you be angry? Why would you, why would you do any, why would you be melting down on social media? It's just an election. It's just the election. It's just another guy in an office somewhere far away, all this type of thing. It's a very different mood than you see from people on the left. And I think a lot of people on the left don't necessarily understand that like they just don't take it that seriously. It's just not, yeah, the election happened, we're going to wake up tomorrow and go on with our lives and thank God that's over, sort of thing. However, I do think with the whole liberal checkout of politics and media and all this type of thing, that we're probably going to see that a bit of apathy from both sides. But it's a very different thing. And so when you have people who, well intentioned but poorly executed, attacking Trump supporters, it then, to the right, it then really seems like oh, these people are crazy. They're attacking people just for being a Trump supporter. Like, it's not that important. Why do you care so much? Because I think for a lot of them, it's just not that important. But either way, don't go attacking people just because they're a Trump supporter. Conversely, don't go attacking people just because they voted Democrat or voted for Kamala Harris. If there's any one temperature we need to lower in this country, it's the politics temperature and the use of physical violence. The advantage of liberal democracy is that we mute the human violent impulses to kill each other at every turn. That's what government is for. And the more violence that we engage in, the more you get towards a government breakdown where you end up with violence in the streets. And that, I think, is something we all would like to avoid. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about the Pod Save America interviews. So last week, Jon Favreau on Pod Save America, he did 2 interviews that have been making the rounds, particularly among leftist spaces. One was with Kamala Harris's campaign managers, including David Plouffe, and the other one was with Hassan Piker, the very well-known leftist streamer. And obviously, the Democrat Party is continuing to implode after their election loss. I think a lot of people were floored by how the Harris people were kind of like, the political wins were against us. We never really thought, we had an internal saying that we didn't think we could win. Our internal polling never had her ahead of Trump, sort of thing. We only had 97 days to figure this out. But we ran a great campaign. Things just didn't work out. Sorry, folks. I think people were very kind of floored by that. And then it kind of followed up with Hassan coming on and being like, no, we've abandoned working class values and social democracy. We're not doing the stuff that people care about fixing. It's prices, it's inflation, it's all of these things. And it's getting, not helping working people. It's being mired in identity politics and all this sort of thing. And it sounds very much to the left sort of thing. And that I think is, I think he blamed, because he's obviously farther to the left than Kamala Harris ever was a big Bernie Sanders supporter, and all this type of thing kind of blames Kamala Harris for not really focusing on left-wing populist working values. And I think right now, both these interviews kind of show us that there's a lot of tension right now in the Democrat Party between going after real working class values versus big tent inclusive values. And I think that, obviously, the challenge for Democrats in 2028 is going to be, if we have an election in 2028, is going to be how to get white voters to vote Democrat. And that's a bit of an uphill battle, because the Democrat Party has become synonymous with a lot of very uncomfortable social issues that people are not a huge fan of. It's LGBT issues, particularly the trans issues. It's, racial issues. I still hear people complaining about, Black Lives Matter and 2020 and the Summer of Love and all this type of thing, and the riots, and they tried to burn down the country and they caused $1 billion in damage and all this type of thing, and but somehow that justifies January 6th because that was moved in the country. And I find I'm not a fan of populism from either direction, because populism leads to a very dangerous situation where you start doing things and making policy decisions that are not necessarily the best for the country or the economy, that have lots of unintended consequences, but they seem really good. Now, right-wing populism has the same problem, and it also tends to exclude a lot of people. Left-wing populism, like Peronism in Argentina, can be very good for people in the short term, but absolutely disastrous for an economy long term. And so, I'm not a fan of populism either way. I would like to see a competently run, normal economy that keeps inflation low, unemployment low, and gives people opportunity. I think there's a lot of things we could fix about the economy. Meritocracy being one, getting rid of fake and ghost jobs being another. Posting salaries on job listings would be another. There's lots of things to do. Um, that would move things forward for that. But I think trying to engage in populism as such ends up being a very dangerous game for both sides, and it ends up becoming a tug of war. That leads a lot of regular, ordinary people sort of in the middle and in the dust, as policies sort of whip back and forth, trying to find quote unquote something that works, not understanding greater situations, not listening to experts, all this sort of thing. It reminds me of a funny tweet someone posted that the Democrats feel like the Whigs in the 1850s. They're like, oh yeah, once this whole slavery thing dies down, we can get back to our competent policies and incremental reforms. And it definitely does seem like that, but the reality is that is a far more stable situation than engaging in incredibly dangerous and divisive things. In terms of, the Whigs weren't wrong. You know, the whole throwdown about slavery led to a civil war, split the country in half. We still continue to live in the shadow of things that were done in the 1860s and through Reconstruction to 1877. And it, and that's why I say we've really got to lower the temperature, because this all starts to get very dangerous. And we're now to the point where things are getting dangerous, which kind of brings to my big point about this whole Pod Save America narrative. And that is, do we really want to fight authoritarianism or just be authoritarians? There's too many calls for Democrats to take off the gloves and fight dirty and use every rule and every loophole and everything to stick it to them. But the reality is that makes the country worse. Everyone is worse off when we play these games. And I don't think anyone's really thinking about that. No one's thinking about the long term. Now, when it comes to the right, they're definitely thinking long term. Why do you think they have the Supreme Court packed, the judges, all this type of thing? I mean, the legacy of two Trump administrations will extend for generations at this point. They're thinking long term. The left sure as hell isn't thinking long term. And I think a lot of people are tired. The Democrats are kind of in the party of, oh, let's uphold the norms and values and what makes us important and all this type of thing. And I think, one, that battle is lost. And that's not a good thing. Once you lose the norms and once you lose the guardrails, very dangerous things start to happen. A lot of things that don't necessarily benefit the everyday person. And I think that becomes dangerous all on its own. And I think what worries me about all these conversations we're having right now is no one is thinking long term. No one is thinking about what's going to be good for the country 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Everyone right now is just focused on trying to, well, how do we, get through the next 4 years of Trump? Or how do we, defeat Trumpism when Trump is gone? Or all this sort of thing. And no one is really thinking about what do we need, in future, and what does that look like, and what type of country do we really want to live in? That's not the conversation we're having. And incidentally, while Hassan may complain about the lackluster milquetoast policies coming out of the Democratic Party, the reality is Biden was one of the most progressive administrations we've had forever, more progressive than Obama ever was. Did a lot of very helpful things, didn't message it very well. Democrats tend not to. But you had somebody who was willing to stand up, is here the union address, and say that transgender healthcare is healthcare and very important. Obama never did that. Obama didn't come out for gay marriage until it was basically already a done deal. And Biden did it first. You had a lot of changes in in financing and banking that helps everyday working people. people bemoan the small incremental changes, but as I've always said, that's how you develop change that works. Social change, governmental change, small things implemented over time is where you get there. When you start trying to do really big, really showy, messy things, it tends to cause a big mess. And so it can be helpful to try to do your best when you do big things to mitigate that as much as possible, but also to understand what you're doing, who's to be helped, and most importantly, who's going to be hurt. There's always unintended consequences. You can't avoid them, but you can mitigate them as best as possible. And oftentimes that comes from a series of small incremental changes. Also, and this can also be true, sometimes the solution to a problem doesn't need to be a big showy thing. Sometimes it's something very small. And I think that's what Trump and co. did not understand the first time, but they certainly understand now, is that there are lots of small ways to make your presence, your agenda, your view, and your values, and they do have values, we just don't like them, heard in society and restructure things in a way that can benefit people who share your values and share your agenda and certainly your donors. And that is something that I think, which is really the true understanding of power. And that's something the left, I don't think, really understands, nor do they want to embrace it. And I think it's at their peril. I think it's very hard to, and you'll see this as time goes on. The, reasonable, measured, here's actionable things we can do that are going to be good for people, all this type of thing, that's out the window. Now it's going to be huge, crazy, bombastic, policies, big values, big agenda stuff, all this type of thing, without really thinking about what's it going to take to actually get that done, and who's going to be affected, and who's going to be hurt by it. That conversation is all out the window. And so it's going to kind of, everyone's going to start to adopt this whole Trump way of doing things. And that's not good long term. I'm not quite sure that's a country any of us really want to live in. But who listens to me? So, let's go over to... Can we do that? Yes, we can. A handful of news stories that I have. Let's actually go here first. So, I want to talk about this very interesting story. Oh, that's the Whig Party tweet. I did save it. Centrist Dems just refuse to recognize the new political order we are witnessing. They're like the Whig Party in the 1850s being like, once this whole slavery thing dies down, we'll be able to get back to our sensible policies and about internal improvements. It's, yeah. And obviously the thread is whatever. But I did save that. That was that tweet. I didn't need to quote it. It should have just read it to you. Oh yes, Ken Klippenstein. We're going to get to debanking here in a minute. I thought this was interesting because, speaking of norms and values and ideas, Hakeem Jeffries was talking with Liz Cheney, and Ken obviously posted a bit of it from C-SPAN, and was like, if you're wondering whether Democratic leadership learned anything about the wisdom of associating with Liz Cheney, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries sat down with her this week to talk about democracy. And in talking about elections come, elections go, presidents come, presidents go. But these values, these norms, these ideas, these institutions have to hold. And this reply right here. No one cares about norms and congeniality when the institutions fail them. That, I think, is the central part. I was reading today, someone said that voters are looking for someone who's going to fix the system and improve things for them. And we're going, kind of all these series of one-term presidencies trying to find someone who will actually do something. And I think the uncomfortable aspect of this all is that I don't think politicians can fix it. I think that's the hard part. I think there's other bigger things at play, but voters don't want to hear that. It's like inflation is not caused is being caused by supply chain shortages and changes in the global economy. Everywhere has inflation right now. Everywhere has inflation. Can't escape it. We're just not having it as bad as everybody else. Well, no one cares about that because the price of their groceries went up. They can't afford a new car. All this sort of thing. Um, and I fear we're not going to be in a good place as a country with what's changing and how things are shifting. And I wish more people thought about that. I'm glad Hakeem Jeffries is having that conversation. Maybe not necessarily with Liz Cheney, but yes, institutions do have to hold. But I also agree, nobody cares how well the institution is doing if the institution does not serve them. And if there's one thing people do want, is that they want government to work for them, to solve their problems, to make things better for them. And I don't necessarily know that that's possible, at least the way that people would like it to be. So, getting off of all of that, this is going to be a long one because we're already at 45 minutes, which is when I usually stop and we have some stories to get through. So, let's turn ourselves to the news. So, this one is very interesting. So, this one started on Twitter this week, and some people on tech were complaining that they had been debanked during the Biden administration, where banks refused to service their business, particularly people in the crypto space. And this also started even more so when Mark Andreessen went on Joe Rogan talking about that, all these tech executives, especially in the crypto space, had been thrown out of their banks and all this type of thing. And so it says here that the original Operation Choke Point was an Obama-era program targeting the bank accounts of those engaged in consumer fraud, though it became a lightning rod for conservative outrage. Andreessen claimed those debanked founders had no choice but to hold all their money in cash or keep applying to different banks until they found one that would take all their business. Andreessen did not provide evidence for his claim, although Elon Musk talked about it even more, and Coinbase co-founder Brian Armstrong talked about it even more. And obviously, there's a lot of banks that will know their customer and will not take certain business because it becomes a liability. If you're a bank that takes on the business of someone who's a criminal, you are liable for that and can be, sued and fined, as we saw with the HSBC situation over their acquisition of banks in Mexico that were laundering cartel money. And it says here, the crypto industry in particular has long felt the government was using bank regulatory power to target it. Earlier this month, Coinbase released a trove of documents that said pointed to a concerted effort by the administration to crack down on banks working with crypto companies. In the waning days of the first Trump administration, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency advanced a rule that would have prevented banks from denying access to broad classes of people. Just after Joe Biden took office, the OCC suspended that fair access rule from moving forward. It's not exactly clear who lost what services when or why, but the claim alone will likely sustain a controversy and possibly spur investigations after the second Trump presidency begins on January 20th. Now that we have that as a basis, I then was looking at the stuff on Twitter, and I found this really great thread from Mark Stoller, who said, a good amount of the I was debanked because of the state stories are along the lines of, I said something controversial on Twitter and Citi closed my bank account while not mentioning the meth business they were running on the side. U.S. law enforcement runs in part through the banking system. If you don't like that, change the laws, but you can't engage in money laundering, illicit drug dealing, or fraud. You're not being politically persecuted if you do these things, and there are consequences. A lot of crypto people believe that they have the right to avoid North Korean sanctions or engage in money laundering or Ponzi scheming while getting bailed out if there are problems. They will probably win that political fight now, but in 2020 that stuff was actually still illegal. Everyone has to stop at stop signs, even if they've done nothing wrong. Sometimes society takes prophylactic measures. That's just what it means to live with some semblance of law and order. And talking about the balance between government overreach and if this stuff is fair at all and all this sort of thing. The reality is, and I read this because the reality is crypto, and I've even observed this in my own normal life. Crypto is a really easy way to cover up illicit transactions. Back in the day, it was a lot harder to do. You had to find a payment service that wouldn't ask a lot of questions, do a lot of subterfuge, all this sort of thing. Now, with crypto, anyone can open a crypto wallet, you can buy some cryptocurrency, and you're off and running. Um, and so the reality is these banks investigate these people, find out what type of business they're running, and for their own risk management and to keep a banking license in this country, they choose not to do business with certain people. And so if you've been hearing about this, I wanted to bring it up and talk about it and go from there. We're going to come back to that inflation number. This is a very interesting chart. So while we're on the subject of banks, I wanted to take a look at this story. Which is, and this is very interesting because it's very European. So Walmart shoppers may not need credit cards anymore. Our bank account transfer is better. It says here in 2023, Walmart notched a whopping 611 billion in revenue, a 6.7% increase from an already impressive 2022. So when Walmart recently indicated its desire to cut out payment companies, the news garnered headlines. In fact, the retail behemoth said it would soon offer a new payment option where consumers could opt for instant bank account transfers instead of using a credit or debit card. This move would likely spike revenue for the leading company on the Fortune 500 even further, as it would not have to pay payment processing fees to credit card merchants for these purchases. While this move clearly makes financial sense for Walmart, is it the best option for consumers? It says here, in a bank account transfer, money is moved from one bank to another. This can happen in person, through a mobile app, or online, or by phone. For Walmart, it will be offered to online shoppers. Bank account transfers have several key benefits. They are safe, they prevent unwanted interest payments, and they are convenient. And it is talking about Walmart Pay and if this is going to become a whole thing. This is a very, I saved this story because this is a very European thing to do. So in Europe, unlike the United States, it's extremely common for people to, exchange money between themselves to pay. In fact, the hosting company I use for the Cameron Journal doesn't have a payment processor. They just have bank account transfer because in Europe, a lot of transactions happen that way. I actually can't use it because of different payment systems, and I have a friend who's gonna help me with that. But it's very, so I think it's interesting. I think Walmart trying to cut out Visa, MasterCard, Amex, all this type of thing as much as possible, at least giving people the option to do it in online shopping and all this type of thing is very is very interesting. I mean, their bill to card processors is, in the billions of dollars, I would imagine, or at least the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'm sure they probably have special negotiated rates for Visa and MasterCard because of the volume of business they do every day. But them trying to give shoppers another, and also Walmart also understanding their customer, for people that, don't necessarily have cards, whatever have you, or only have, simple banking or whatever. Then it gives people options, to pay in different ways. Walmart Pay, you can just kind of deposit money there and pay that way. And so all of these cut out Visa and MasterCard, one way or another. And I mean, let's face it, if Walmart can get 10-20% adoption, how many tens of millions in credit card fees do they save? It's more profit for the bottom line for them. So, but very European of Walmart. Very impressive. The other story I wanted to touch on is here we have Trump and his tariffs again. We have this interesting story. So, for those who don't know, the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. It started out as Brazil, Russia, India, China. They've got friends now. Have recently had a summit, and they launched a new BRICS Pay system. Russia, because it got cut out of the SWIFT system due to the war in Ukraine, has been trying to start its own payment system with friendly nations that's separate from what the West uses. And the BRICS have sort of kicked around the idea of trying to have a central currency. No, I don't think that's going to go anywhere because nobody has a currency worth buying it. Nobody wants Brazilian reals. The ruble is basically worthless. India, the rupee, no. And China, the yuan is pegged to the dollar. It doesn't free float, and nobody wants yuans anyway. So, and I don't know what they use in South Africa. I should look that up, but no one wants that either. And Egypt, enough said. Ethiopia, not even a conversation. Iran is isolated. The UAE does all their business in dollars. Why? Because that's the money you do business with. So, them trying to form their own currency is rather silly. But what's interesting is they got applications from Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Malaysia have applied to become members, and other countries have expressed interest in joining in order to kind of get out of the US and the Western controlled system. But Trump has said that if the BRICS try to undermine the US dollar, they will face a 100% tariff on their exports to the United States. And it says here, while the US dollar is by far the most used currency in global business and has survived past challenges to its preeminence, members of the alliance, not the developing nations, say they are fed up with America's dominance of the global financial system. The dollar represents roughly 58% of the world's foreign exchange reserves, according to the IMF, and major commodities like oil are still primarily bought and sold using dollars. The dollar's dominance is threatened, however, with BRICS' growing share of GDP and the alliance's intent to trade in non-dollar currencies, a process known as de-dollarization. Trump, in a Truth Social post, said, quote, "We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling in the wonderful US economy." At a summit of BRIC nations in October, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the US of weaponizing the dollar and described it as a big mistake. "It's not us who refuse to use the dollar," Putin said at the time, "but if they don't let us work, what can we do? We are forced to search for alternatives." So, I don't necessarily think that's going anywhere in the immediate term, but I do, mostly because the BRICS just don't have their act together enough um, to have a stable enough currency to create a new currency. But I do think if they start creating payment systems and start doing, as China and Russia have done, trading in their own local currencies, that could begin to undermine the US dollar. I do find it interesting that while Russia is leading the way on this, Trump is trying to shut it all down. One would think that Putin would have a little bit more say and all of that. So I think that's interesting. But it's international news that I thought was important to talk about and cover. Not necessarily enough to write about, but you should know that that's a thing. You know, when you hear about the BRICS and what's happening with de-dollarization, it's important because a lot of this stuff gets talked about and people don't know enough about it or understand the dynamics at play or how international trade works. And so you're smarter now for knowing it. Now, final story, because we're almost at the top of the hour. We have the U.S. core inflation rate video here. So let me back up for a moment. Bravos Research, great channel. This chart is very interesting. Well, this whole video is very interesting because they're talking about that we might have another bump up. I'm trying to figure out, is it this? It is this segment. Another bump up of inflation. So with this chart here, we kind of see where inflation normally when we see some spikes in the one in the 70s, that's the oil crisis, and then inflation comes down, then it peaks back up in the late 70s, and then falls under Reagan, and then kind of goes back up in the late 80s, and early 90s, and then finally falls back down to the 2-3% that we're used to, usually staying typically very much below that, and then the spike during the pandemic. And here we are. What they're maintaining is that it actually might go up again. Here's this chart here. And so what he is saying is that just like how we had sort of this big climb and then dip and then an even higher climb, notice that inflation in 1979, 1980 was higher than it ever was at the oil crisis, which is this part charted here, is that we're already kind of at that, we're like at 71. It's 1971 and we're going to, things might fall again and then spike and then fall a lot and then really spike. And so what he's saying here is that when the inflation monster may not yet be beat, and we might need to brace ourselves for even higher inflation than we've had in the past because the inflation monster is not over. If you want to kind of hear his whole thesis, which I think I don't know that I buy it, but it's interesting. Bravo's research on YouTube. You should definitely check that out because his thesis is compelling. The chart, and he goes through all of this for 11 minutes, sort of thing. The chart is compelling, I will say, and especially he goes into how the inflation rate is calculated and why they exclude food and fuel and a lot of the stuff I've talked about if you want to get into it that far. But this chart here was very interesting. And yeah, that's a compelling case that inflation may not yet be over. Oh, there we go. So, that's the news this week for December 2nd, 2024. Um, that was a long one. I usually try to keep this to 45 minutes, but here we are having gone all this long way. And so, yeah, so let me let you go. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal News Hour. Keep up with me at CameronJournal.com. You can catch me on Blue Sky at CameronJournal.bsky.social. On Twitter, Instagram at Cameron Cowan. Facebook.com/Cameron L. Cowan. And on LinkedIn, Cameron Cowan as well. So, keep up with me for more research and insights. I have some exciting new content stuff coming up. And this week's interview was with Tim Mulligan about his graphic novel, Snitchland, which takes place in the same universe in a former nuclear facility. Very paranormal, very spooky, and Tim Mulligan is great. He's a writer's writer. He's a lot of fun. He's very sophisticated, and I just love talking to him. So that's the interview this week. Check him out. It's a short one, because we're talking about fiction. Those are short, only a half hour. Short interview this week, the news hour. When you head over to CameronJournal.com, if you want the Cameron Journal delivered to your inbox every week, I do an exclusive newsletter. Sign up for that. The pop-up comes right up. Give it literally 5 seconds. It'll bug you. Comes right up asking you to sign up. If you sign up for that, you can get the Cameron Journal delivered directly to your inbox. Every week I send out a newsletter wrapping up the week's headlines, stories I'm following, plus the interview, plus the latest news hour. So if it's the fastest way to keep up with me. So CameronJournal.com for all the links and sign up for the newsletter. Tim Mulligan's your interview this week. Thank you so much. I will see you next week on the Cameron Journal News Hour. Have a great night.